Da da dee da dee da dee da dee da. I have a deep commitment to living in a way that creates room for more ways of being. That in our current structure, there's a narrowing of how we're supposed to be, that we're picking up on at all different moments in our lives. It's happening in really overt ways and also really subtle ways where we're being taught how we're supposed to navigate the world, how we're supposed to inhabit our relationships. And that part of my commitment and exploration is around how do we open that back up again and be able to hold multiplicities of experiences, multiplicities of ways of being and ways of enacting health and reciprocity in relationships. So one of the things in working with young people that I feel really grateful for is the ways in which I'm consistently receiving the reflection that I'm only able to give what I really am giving to myself, that I can only give the love and support to young people to the extent that I am also offering that to myself, and that the most meaningful things that I can give are things that are part of who I am, that are really living in me, not just in my mind, but on these multiple levels. And in navigating in a world that has leaned in the last, over an arc of the last 10,000 years, has leaned more and more towards intellectual ways of processing what it is to be human and prioritizing mind, that sourcing from different parts of who I am feels important. So I'm giving that to myself in this moment, knowing that is directly proportional to what I'm then able to give in my relationships. So that's a long way of saying I might pause sometimes. Can I tell y'all some stories? I want to start with some context of who I am and how I come to the questions that currently feel like the guiding questions in my life. And we'll start with my mother, whose name is Jaina, who we spent a lot of time, just the two of us, in nature when I was a young person. And the context of our way of moving through the land together was felt very poignantly like conversation. And at age like maybe 8, 9, 10, I started to be like, wow, my mom is really, really weird. And when we're walking in public places and I see a red-tailed hawk flying overhead, I'll like grab her arm and be like, Mom, please don't make a red-tailed hawk cry in public. And in just the context I was growing up in, that was so highly abnormal and unusual. But that was the arc of my young life, was being with a woman whose relationship with the natural world was really pretty profound, and who did what we know as a sit spot, but was not termed as such to me at that point. Every morning and every evening would be out on the porch and knew all of the blue jays by name and could pick them apart and played these phenomenal games with them where she'd lay out things on a piano keyboard, lay out peanuts, and they'd come and take peanuts off in different orders, and she would then play the songs back to them that they would create through their removing of peanuts from this. And as a musician, her way of listening to birds was particular. And as we moved through, she was consistently picking out bird songs and then calling them back. It was really not cool. None of my friends' parents did that ever. A sweet story is coming to mind from the time when she lived in Georgia for a little while and has a deep love of Baltimore Orioles, and would say every summer there would be a morning when she would come to me and she'd say, Melodie, I think today's the day that the Baltimore Orioles are going to come back. And consistently the Orioles would show up in the willow tree in the backyard. And they have a particularly beautiful call that's kind of like, I'm not going to whistle it right now, but on a tonal level, it's like da-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da. It has that sweetness to it. And in missing that call in Georgia, she found a nest of mockingbirds, baby mockingbirds, and she started cruising by there multiple times a day if possible and whistling little bits of the Baltimore Oriole song to the mockingbirds, and then they'd struggle through it, and when they were able to repeat back that first little bit, she'd add in another little bit and slowly taught the Baltimore Orioles the mockingbirds this whole Baltimore Oriole song. And then when she moved away from there, she went back years later, and all of the mockingbirds in that area now have Baltimore Oriole in their repertoire, which is not a bird local to that area. And through my mother's way of relating to nature, and particularly birds, I remember walking through childhood with a distinct feeling that there's this whole layer of life, of relationships, this whole web that is happening all the time that we're not paying attention to. It was kind of like this little secret between my mom and I in a way. It was like not everybody knows it, but there is so much life and beauty that we are a part of. And an interesting discernment too as a little person to figure out, it was clear that in the world outside of my home, that was not normal, in a way where to be talking about those things felt really alienating. And so just to be in that discernment of how to both stay connected to something that feels really true and real and full of joy and vitality and life, and navigate the world that I was being asked to navigate, which feels like one of the central questions that I imagine we can each find points of relationship to, that of what it is to be living in a world and in a structure and network of systems that don't necessarily create a whole lot of room for staying connected to the things that we know on a deep gut soul level are really important, and that are what it's kind of about being here. And so there was that thread of experience that kind of opened up the knowing that there's always more going on than we're necessarily taught to pay attention to. And also that through my mother's way of interacting with life, that I was learning a lot without realizing that I was learning it. The same goes for music, where music was part of our everyday exchange and our flow of interacting with one another, in a way where she was, years later, she was like, oh yeah, I was very intentionally teaching you pattern recognition in music, or kind of music theory, but not on an intellectual level, on a felt sense level, on a embodied feeling it kind of way. And I felt that in her way of relating with nature also. And so years later to be in this, wow, I learned so much from my mother that I didn't realize I was learning. So I'm going to hop back to birds and my mom and that part of things, and how keyed in she was to what the jays sounded like when a cat was passing through the neighborhood versus what the jays sounded like when a dog was passing through the neighborhood. And so I then at age 11 went to an art of mentoring for the first time, which is where I've met many of you previously, and had this pretty potent experience of this whole realm of being that I had kind of tucked into the secrecy of my home life with my mother and set aside in my time in public school and navigating world, all of a sudden had a place to express. And not only did I have a place to express, but I had a place to express in the context of community, as opposed to the isolation of being in that with my mom. And that was also a kind of a healing moment for me, because I saw my mom moving in some ways deeper and deeper into isolation from other human beings, the deeper she went into relationship with the natural world. And just this feeling in myself like that something else is possible, but not knowing really where that existed. So that was clearly I still show up at Art of Mentorings however many years later. So it was a significant moment for me to get to be in community, and also to have a structure that was validating some of what my mom knew, because she was actually showing up for her relationships with wild beings and being willing to learn through that and actually be informed by them. Like, there was what I experienced as a pretty deep reverence in her for wild earth as primary teacher, which to me models a lot of humility in her humanness, that she was in that kind of relationship with wild beings, of allowing herself to be informed by them in the way that she was living. So then having the structure that was like, bird language is a real thing. There's actually systems of communication in the bird world that we can tap into and start to pick apart these patterns and have a different lens into what is going on. I wonder what it felt like in my 11-year-old self. I think there was a feeling of relief and allowing parts of myself actually to come back home to me in a way. And also shifted the way that I was relating to my mother, who received a fair amount of my eye rolls and arm grabs prior to her connecting with nature in public places. So after high school, which was an influential experience, I also went to a pretty small, fairly alternative high school that was very racially and culturally and socioeconomically diverse, which changed through being in relationships with people coming from really different places, my understanding of the world was changed. And which started guiding me down this track of how do I actually, starting to perceive some of the inequity that's pretty evident, I think, in the world that we're living in it right now, regardless of where we're sitting in society, our kind of social location. I saw some head nods that, like, social inequity in the world is something that we're aware of. And so I think that's part of what sparked questions around how do we really bring health to our relationships, and like also starting to decode some of the structures that we exist within, the structures and the systems that guide human interactions, and finding more and more that the tools of nature connection, the kind of core practices of nature connection, of asking questions, of recognizing patterns, felt like they applied so directly to the questions that I was asking about human systems. And so I've been over time kind of exploring this question of how can the practices of nature connection support us in being able to see what is happening in social systems and in interpersonal relationships between humans, but also relationships on different levels. So not just interactions between individuals, but also interactions that are happening on larger levels, on systemic levels, and on structural levels. And starting to see more and more the ways in which the same patterns that are operating, the same ways that we relate to the natural world, and I actually want to be careful with that language because we recognize that there are people that do not relate to place in these ways, but that that much of the kind of dominant culture that I grew up within, and that I think many of us have grown up within, relates to land in an extractive and exploitive way. And we live in a human supremacist system. And watching the distortion of relationships, there's a way in which I'm starting to think and speak more about what I call or what are termed systems of oppression, as it's really a distortion of relationship, a distortion of healthy relationship on all levels. That there's systems that remove us from our capacity to inhabit health in our relationships on all levels, and starting to feel more and more like, whoa, the same ways that we are relating to land and that are playing out in huge destruction environmentally are like the same patterns that are playing out in social realms. So as we're in these nature connection practices, we're actually getting to study with the teacher. And just that same question of like, wow, my mom taught me so much that I didn't realize I was learning. In my questions of how do we bring more equity and real health into relationships across difference, to disrupt patterns of harm, what have I been learning that I didn't realize I was learning from Earth? And starting to go through my nature connection experience as a young person through that lens of how does this actually equip me to be able to inhabit healthy relationships across difference? What is needed in building healthy relationships across difference? Which, of course, between any two human beings is endless difference. And there's a lot of layers that get added on when we start talking about race and class and gender and cultural background and socioeconomic. I'm just going to give a thank you and be in the authenticity of like, this is not the format that I usually express it. And I feel very geared towards dialogue and conversation. And so to be in, there's like, I've been like kind of fighting with it over the last couple of months. Like, do I even want to do that? Like the dynamic of one person talking and a bunch of people listening, and the kind of implicit assumptions that person knows something. And also being willing to step into sharing of experience and that question that I put back to you all. So I'm going to let myself pause. I'm realizing how I really am oriented towards conversation and dialogue. And so I am going to pause and ask for questions and see if there's something that I then actually feel to go towards. And if not, then I will start unpacking some of how I specifically see bird language supporting us in understanding how power is moving through social systems. Yeah.
I was struck by the story of hearing about you and your mom growing up and everything, and then to realize there was a structure around that, like the bird language and all that. I guess my question to you is, do you still feel like you're drawn on that intuitive level to learn, or I guess I'm wondering, how do you feel like the structure that was out there has actually guided you or actually maybe interfered for you on your path?
When you say the structure, do you mean the structure of bird language?
Yeah, like actually studying it, or, learning more in depth about, what the bird calls actually mean, or the research that has been done, or the work that others have done to actually explain to you, like, oh, that call means this, or that call means this, or whatever it was that your learning taught you. I don't know if I'm being totally clear, but I guess I'm just looking for the distinction between the way that you were taught through nature and through your mom in sort of an indirect way versus actually being shown the blueprint, and how that might have affected your...
Right. Well, I was shown the blueprint after already feeling an intuitive and authentic draw towards that. So the blueprint was then really helpful for me because I already had the inspiration towards that, and guided me into a deepening of my practice around going to sit spots and starting to pull apart the bird language world. And there are all these moments in a bird language, like, it's a powerful thing to be at a sit spot with a group of people at a bird language event or whatever, or with friends, just keying into bird language, and to be in the recognition of how my perception of what is happening is influenced by where I'm sitting. That my perception of the truth of what's happening in the bird world is expanded when I connect with the stories of the people around me, when I'm actually looking at things from different perspectives in a very literal sense. Like, I can't see behind that tree because I'm sitting right here and my friend can see behind that tree. And just that in itself, the recognition that the way we see the world is influenced by where we're sitting, is a big one as we start to explore where are we sitting within these systems of inequity. I want to name that I'm coming to the kind of conversations around anti-oppression work or anti-racism work from a belief that nobody within an oppressive system is served by that system. That even those of us who occupy sites of power, that like as a white person, I recognize that I have privilege in the structure that we live within. And there's also a loss. There's a cost on a soul level to participating in something that is doing harm. And if we believe that we live in a world that is interconnected, which when we're looking at ecology, when we're looking at the bird world and we're, tapping into what's happening on those levels, we start to get that felt sense of the interconnectedness. Bird language for me has been a profound gateway into a feeling of belonging. Because there's also a moment in a bird language journey when we recognize, oh, I am impacting this. This world around me of dynamic and brilliant life is responding to my presence, is constantly giving me feedback about how I'm moving. There's the concept that maybe some of you are familiar with of a concentric ring or a zone of disturbance around us. That as we're moving, there's this kind of space around us where we're pushing birds or animals away from us or where they're alarming at us. And I've heard this, there's the concept of expanding our field of awareness beyond our zone of disturbance, and then practices for pulling that zone of disturbance in. And then the question of, well, wow, are some of the ways that I can do that through bird language applicable to how I can do that in my relationships with other humans, how I can move through these systems as a person occupying both seats of, both seats of privilege and also places where I'm in on a class level. I come from a lower class, working class family and grew up with two parents living and working below the poverty line. And so that experience of class has, it's like I'm not in the power seat in that one, but I'm in the power seat in other ways. So lots of intersections. But how can I move in who I am in a way that is expanding my zone of awareness and pulling my zone of disturbance in, that then enables me to experience relationships, depth of relationships in a really different way. This is weird, but I'm grateful for that question because it helps me orient. Questions help me orient. Yeah.
The part that was in there that was really juicier was the idea of you're talking about bringing the zone of disturbance in and spreading the zone of awareness out, and then I felt like you're maybe going to shift towards somehow like how that is also transferable on a social level, and that I was like kind of inspired to hear that maybe that was it.
Well, I think that's right. It takes being able to recognize some of the impact that we're having in order to be able to call that in. That can be a really painful process. Because if we conceive of ourselves as interconnected beings, and we really believe and feel that our well-being is intricately tied in with the well-being of every other life on the planet, that to recognize any of the places where we actually start to see that we may have been that we are unintentionally, perhaps, negatively impacting the lives around us can be painful. And to get back to what you were saying, thank you for that question, is the importance of being willing to see how we're impacting the spaces around us. Whose lives are we actually connected to and then impacting? And so starting to like pull back some of the I mean, I hear the how question in there. Like, so then how do we do that? And how does it happen in bird language? And that's the part where I'm totally in the question. And this is more than anything an invitation to you all to join me in the question of how do we apply what we are learning as humans right now about how to step back into reciprocal relationship with place. How do we apply that also to other levels and layers? Because if it is the same patterns, the same kind of belief system and worldview that's impacting and distorting our relationships with place and our relationships with other human beings, how we actually relate to one another across difference, then there's a kind of a half thing that happens if we're only engaging with how do we weave ourselves back in with ecology and not how do we renew healthy relationships in social systems. Delmar.
I love the bird language conversation, and when I first learned about it, I'm like, well, wait a minute. As a naturalist, there's the lizard's little zone of disturbance and awareness too, and then there's the bugs there's the grasshoppers that sled up, and when you walk into a field with wild horses, that honoring thing like we do with the geese, they feel you visually. There's like all this communication going on with the wild world that's nonverbal, and they say with humans even that 70% of the communication is nonverbal. And I kind of feel like that sensitivity with bird language can teach us that there's a lot going on that we are not so sensitive to, that's being communicated by us and by other things, that isn't something we can put words on. It's more that honoring that, okay, am I honoring that thing by clumsily tripping into that meadow? Mm-hmm. And if I come into it slowly and I see there's an animal there and I stop and I pretend to eat grass and I just get little glimpses of it instead of going like this with my flat predator face at it. To me, there's so many layers of communication happening with so many different species. And the more sensitive we are to it, it is a social experiment of sorts, different species communication happening all the time. Mm-hmm. And I do think what I learned about horse training applies to human beings very well. This way that we are with each other becomes more visible to me after working with a horse that's very sensitive. The movement of a hand, the movement of your head, the movement of where you're holding your head, all that is a big conversation to the horse. And so I think it's all great. I think it's like this big soup of communication and relationship that's going on. Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful. Thanks for bringing the piece around honoring routine, which is, that sensitivity to where another being is at, and then responding and moving with sensitivity to that, understanding that there are many layers of communication that are happening. A challenging thing in moving these things into relationships, social relationships, is that we live in a soup. It's like it's hard to see the water that we're swimming in kind of a thing, wherein over the course of our lives we are receiving so much information all the time about how to be with other people. and how to be with people who look like we do, and how to be with people who don't look like we do. And there are so many, there are so many subtle pieces that then we have to like translate that in our human relationships. There's just layers of complexity that can be just uncomfortable to be looking at, so that we can actually inhabit honoring routine in our relationships with those around us. I mean, something as simple as listening. There was a moment I was sitting listening to the frogs singing, and I was just like, wow, they are so good at singing with the fullness of their voice in a way that is still leaving space for all of the frogs around them to sing. Like, I could spend the rest of my life just working on that. Like, how is it that I can inhabit space where I am in the fullness of who I am, in the fullness of my voice and the power of that, in a way that is always leaving room and space for the beings around me to also step into that. Like, I don't think it actually serves for me, like, making more space for people around me to inhabit their full selves, I don't think is actually served by me contracting the truth of who I am. And just the capacity of those frogs to like hear each other. Oh, I had so many questions about those frogs. They were so incredible. I could actually feel like in my ears. They were just amazing. Yeah, Paul.
So you said two things. Well, you said a lot of things, but the two that I wanted to touch were this frog moment where you heard the full-bodied expression of being with room for everyone else to do that, which then becomes a question of, wow, how can I be that way in my world where I can be fully me and actually make everyone else fully them. So I'm just looking at this moment where you're not the isolated naturalist who can't be in the world, and you're trying to say, this is a model, this can be a teaching for me. And so the teaching piece is what's calling to me when I'm hearing you. The other one being just in the presence of bird language, that study and that moment when you have the realization that, yeah, the birds and the natural world and all the other beings are in this relationship, and I'm studying it, and I'm also being studied, and my being studied is part of what I'm studying because it's the reactions, and it's, wow, the impact that I'm having. And so the question, and this is something that you and I talk about on the phone, and something that I'm in the presence of as a study for myself right now, and it's this. It's that when we move through the world and our culture and our privileges, we're trying to build a worldview. I don't think anybody doesn't do that. And by worldview, I mean cosmology in the traditional sense. These are all the things I believe, and here's why. And trying to formulate something cohesive and structured and solid and able to hold me in times of grief or challenge or joy. And it doesn't completely fracture. And I don't need multiple cosmologies through all my relationships, because that's the chaos of so much of what's asked of us. Is it's so much information. It's so diverse. You got this mom who, holy smokes, she's like an indigenous bird witch, and you're like, don't freaking so you're, because that world that she was inhabiting was not the world you were in school at and with your friends. So this question of like, how do we form a cosmology that has cogency and coherency, we can walk through the world with it and be okay, and it's flexible and it's dynamic and it's growing and emerging, but it's not constantly thrown into question. So, and I want to use that term cosmology and just mention that indigenous peoples, that's kind of what the anthropologist is always trying to study. Is like, what is their belief system and where does it come from? And the answer that I keep seeing is, well, it comes from in an indigenous community. Their belief systems come from everything that they see in the more than human world and in their relationship with it. So they're sitting and hearing the frog and hearing the bird and spooking the horses and the bugs and the lizards. It's all the ways that they encounter and engage and relate, and then all the stories that they have created to tell their children to help them move into that world and make sense of it. So the indigenous cosmology is like ornaments that are on this rooted tree that's basically organically coming out of the earth. It's this natural, organic architecture that they've laid and built their entire belief and value and ethical system on. So then come to us, most of us, who are not in an indigenous, nature-based, experiential world. We're in a whole different world, and so we're trying to build cosmology, and it's really, really hard. And so I guess what I'm going to ask you, if you care to vamp on it, is the question of, is the listening to the frogs in the Selenian's home range, is the study of the birds, are all these layers of what we call nature connection, because we're naming it, but all these practices and these engaging things, and are they about helping us reactivate a cosmology that's actually, the architecture comes from the natural world, which is where we emerged from and what we're built upon, and there's no escaping that. That's our entire evolutionary story came out of that and through that. We are of that. So the architecture of our values and beliefs has to have some relationship to that. So I'm just wondering if the answer, if not to say the answer, but is one of the, because for me, why I answer is for me, and I want to know if this makes sense to you, why I am committed to the study and the practice and the ongoing engagement and the ongoing question of my own interface with land and nature and story and ancestor and history is because I'm trying to reactivate a healthy architecture upon which to build my worldview so it will be solid and coherent and worthy of a young person emulating, that they can actually take parts of it and build their own. I don't want to pull it from Western philosophers or gurus or religions because they all seem to be an artifice that's not grounded. They all seem to have emerged from historic and other precedents that are not, the architecture's not organic. It's not. So that's a lot. But I kind of hear that in your question about how do I confront systems of oppression, or maybe confront's not the right word, but how do I engage them to dismantle them? And even that feels like empire. How do I live in a way that is healing? And how does my practice of bird language support that? And I think you already said it in a couple ways, but I wonder if we can talk about cosmology and beliefs and the architecture that nature is offering us. I don't know. I want to just ask you that very long-winded question.
Yeah. Well, I hear I hear both question and response in your reflection there. So I think that some of it, I would say, you just beautifully spoke to and answered. And the piece in there that I'm keying into in this moment is around, there's a piece around cultivating unmediated relationship to life, to world, to nature, to spirit, to whatever it is, where we are knowing things not because we're emulating it or not because it's been received from some intellectual model or framework, but because we actually know it and feel it deeply in ourselves. And I think that that's part of like the role of culture, is to create mechanisms wherein everybody within it can experience in a very real and personal way the truth of the frameworks of understanding or the cosmology. And there's this, it seems like pretty clear that a lot of our current ecological and environmental issues are the result of cosmologies that don't align with natural law, so to speak. And so how to be in the resourcing of, here's one. I'm going to pause on that word, resourcing. I've been thinking about that word lately because I had a moment of sitting next to this really dear spider and watching it trying to build a wall, a web on a brick wall, and it kept falling and then climbing back to its starting point and falling, and it would spin and then it would lose its grip. And I was just thinking about that word resource, of like resource as actually coming back to our own center. And in that, in your question around, this is a multi-layered question you just asked. It was like pretty complex. piece, but just how to be I think I really believe in our capacity to remember, and that in our humanness as parts, as extensions and expressions of Earth, that we have a lot of layers, a lot of generations of socialization and distortion that it's part of, as I see it, the work of our times to be sorting through. And also really beautiful. What is it to actually pick up our lines and say, yes, I am willing to be a vehicle for the transformation of trauma in my lineage, whether that's trauma received or trauma then given back out again. And that in that there's that line that we carry, and also we are extensions of Earth, and we have the capacity to remember and feel in very deep ways when we're in health, and when we're in reciprocity and good relationship, and when we're not. And that as we key into that with the I don't know if this is actually answering the question at all, or
I keep wanting you to talk about the word remember and the way you talked about resource.
What? How do you want to talk about the word remember?
Because it sounds like you're becoming a member again of something.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's there's the bird language piece of like that. I mean, it connects also to like belonging, right? Our sense of, ooh, here's something. I'm just a hodgepodge of thoughts that I just toss out here and there. Y'all are really wonderful. But actually, that's maybe really unrelated.
Go for it.
So, as we are, this is kind of like one of the patterns that I observe and that I'm watchful of, that I'm watching for in my own process of looking for belonging, a sense of being a member within this greater cosmology, within this greater collective of life, of beings. It seems like as human beings, we have a pretty strong tendency at this point to create a sense of belonging through othering, through pushing someone outside of the circle in order to really feel like we are a part of it. And that is one of the things that I think can be really tricky about exploring our identities, especially racial identity, and especially racial identity, where it can be just the question of like, what are the things that we cling to in order to feel part of, but that actually necessitate that somebody is outside of that. And that's a dangerous setup, because as long as I'm experiencing belonging as a result of there being someone that is other, someone that is not part of the circle that I'm part of, I know that that's possible, right? Like my experience of belonging is conditional, because that can always flip, and I am then the one that's being pushed out. So how do we create senses of belonging for ourselves that are not contingent upon feeling identified with a very specific group or with a very specific circle, and that actually expand into a belief that it's possible that we have experiences of belonging that are not that push out. It's like, I think there's that is coupled for me with this narrative that that like oppression is just the way that human beings work, right? Like somebody's always going to be the oppressor and somebody's always going to be the oppressed. If that's your worldview, it becomes really, really scary to think about relinquishing control. If you experience yourself in a position of power, it becomes really scary to think about redistributing power if the story is that creates this, that then you are going to inhabit the role of the person who is experiencing domination or oppression, or you are the person who's then going to get pushed out of the circle. So part of it is how do we look to the way that these things happen in the natural world and start telling different stories also about what is possible and what is real, so that we can. Is that piece making sense?
Well, in the natural world, is the belonging not exclusive in some ways? Is it not that model of, it's not a dominant, submissive, it's not that ordered kind of model. It's a belonging of diverse beings. Is it? So is that, again, an architecture that can then be leveraged?
I think so.
Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm. And through our felt experience of it.
Only, maybe.
Yeah.
So I have an interesting thought that comes up when I hear you talking about this stuff. The problem that I see with human relationships is people are always getting their feelings hurt. My feelings. She hurt my feelings. He hurt my feelings. I don't like that person, and they don't make me feel good. And I just think about the natural world, and I think about like the scrub jay who's like, "Hey, get away from my nest." Doesn't seem to have his feelings hurt. He's just asserting his boundary. And so I'm thinking about this whole othering thing and oppression, and I'm thinking about how we accept people or look at people who are different from us or don't do, maybe aren't adhering to the cultural norm that we feel they should be adhering to. And I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I love it. It's one of the things that I get totally excited about in bird language, or not just bird language. Bird language is one realm that's easy, that's like an entry point to recognizing that there are these patterns like Delmar was speaking about in all of life. When I get a little too close to a horse, I actually meant a deer, but horses have been brought up, and that deer like stomps or snorts or just bounds away, that's feedback. Like I'm being given the feedback that I got a little too close. I pushed a boundary. Something I did not feel good to that being. And it's really easy to receive that as not personal. It's like in a human supremacist system, humans have a really wide zone of disturbance because we're not listening. It's like we're not listening to just the question around what voices are we taught to hear. And that is a question that I'm carrying and would offer here and everywhere generally is, what are the voices that you're listening to? Who's represented in the pool of voices that you're inviting into your life? What perspectives are present there? And are they all coming from this sit spot that's looking in this direction? Or are they actually representative of many different locations that build this broader understanding of what's really happening through it all? So I think, building capacity to receive feedback and not taking it personally and making it about ourselves is a pretty strong skill and is really hard. And I feel like those moments in the natural world, there's a way in which, that's what comes up for me initially is that one. I love that. I'll let you do it, Ellen.
So you mentioned some examples that jumped out at me. One, connecting your experience with nature connection to how it would be in these social structures. And one of them was listening, and one of them was this zone of disturbance, and one of them was not take it personally. And we have a student here at Manzanita that's doing a project showcasing the relationship between destruction of the environment and destruction of like a marriage. And I'm wondering what other things in nature connection, like those three, might apply in that type of situation where it's a one-on-one relationship and you apply those skills. I don't know, are there others that come to mind for you quickly?
That's a good question. I will think about it. So your question is around
just other
what
examples that where you can see that the way that things that you're learning in nature connection practices apply to personal relationships. And you're saying that there are a lot, but there were those 3 specific ones that came out. I'm just looking for more specific ones.
Yeah.
Because those were really helpful to me to try and make those connections. Oh, listening to the birds. Oh, listening to others, and not disturbing nature, and not disturbing others, and not getting your feelings hurt, and not taking it personally.
Yeah. I think there are endless examples, and I'm so excited to continue exploring. Another one that comes to mind right now is like, I think part of how I have thought of it is like awareness is awareness, right? Like awareness when we're tracking an animal on the land, it's building the brain patterns to be able to apply that same style of questioning internally. Like I've heard that's kind of like a nature connection meme of like when you know that however deep you go in a animal tracking journey, that's actually going to translate inwards to an inner tracking, an inner landscape tracking journey, because it's building brain patterns, and to be asking questions and exploring like where I guess the piece in there for me is like how do we ask those same questions that we ask of a coyote moving across the landscape, of the systems that we're in, and also of ourselves in like where is this coming from? I notice pattern recognition skills. Like I see this pattern expressing in myself. Where did it come from? Where did I learn it? Does it serve me? Is it actually in service to the health of my relationships? And Delmar wants to say something.
One thing that keeps coming up in my head as we go around this subject is baseline. There's nature's baseline when we're doing bird language, and there's human baseline. And each person has probably a different baseline of what they're used to from their family, what they're used to from their work, what they're used to from their relationships. I'm a loud, forceful person sometimes, and I know that I'm disturbing people's baseline. I know they're not used to a person like me, unless they come from a big family and they're trying to shout over each other. And so I kind of feel like, that conversation about what baseline is and how it's different for people.
Yeah, and I think also to recognize when some way of being that we carry is preferenced, prioritized, and privileged by the larger structures that we live in. And so then when does our baseline need to shift and change? What are the places where we can actually repattern some of what our baseline is that makes more room for other people getting to experience baseline in their lives?
But still remaining authentic.
Yes, and this is a really interesting piece, right? Of like, I was just in conversations. Yes.
Oh, real excuse.
I don't mean to stray you off to another path, but in bird language, I remember we went out on the bird sit, we sat at a table and did brief, and I think I'm quite a shy person, and I don't speak a lot when meeting new people, but I felt this like call to share these mourning doves who just flew, they weren't very essential to the whole plan, I felt like, but then someone asked me to share, and I did, and everybody's like, oh my God, that was the key. So that was like the nugget. And so my question is, what is the missing nugget in a way for hearing about you as an 11-year-old? I feel like the youth is innocent and it's raw, so kind of what you've been saying. So, and I know you work a lot with teens and children, and I consider myself a child still, so this is coming from me. What do you feel like is missing when you see these people grow up, if that makes any sense?
That's a good question.
I think I'm understanding
Like,
your question.
is it the truth of the nature, or is it like, I just don't know. I don't even know what the missing nugget is, but that's why I'm fleshing it out.
That's a beautiful question, and one that I will not pretend to have an answer for. But I'm in the question with you, and maybe it's like missing nuggets, plural. But I think, can I say the question back and see if it's what you're saying? Are you you're asking about that as young people are growing and developing, is there, like, what is the missing nugget that enables, like, a deeper kind of awareness of impact? Or
Yeah.
I think your question has actually got some more layers than that. It's actually, like, broader and bigger and has some, yeah.
Just, oh, hey Dave.
Maybe it's,
I just want to try to stitch a few things together, because I'm having this sense that there's a question about baseline, there's a question about that Jessica had about other nature connection pieces, and I just want to mention, we've been talking a lot about the natural world, but I want to just go back to the indigenous people and what we claim to know about them and what their baseline looks like compared to ours. And one of our baselines is, I got to be around people who see things like I do. And if I'm around people who don't see things like I do, I got to either convince them of my perspective, or I got to get out of there. There's a tendency to feel really uncomfortable when the baseline is, you got this view and I got this view. If that's baseline, then I got to either change it, because my own identity is wrapped up in, if this thing I think is true and they think something completely different. You can, people say never discuss politics or religion. That's part of where that's coming from. But what I want to say about what I understand, this is really a very early level of understanding. I'm really right now looking for more sources, but what I understand of indigenous peoples, one of their, to generalize, a big commitment in nature-based peoples is to get, to find the music between, you're totally different than me. You got a totally different perspective. And I got this one, and we live here. And where is that actually, that tension harmonic, where's it a harmonics and not a dissonance? Where is there music in that? Because that's baseline. So I've heard it said, the goal in an indigenous culture is to find room for the peace within differences. It's kind of like, it's not how we move. That's not our baseline. Our baseline is we flee from that, or we fight it. We try to group ourselves with people that see like us. So back into the marriage question, how do we live in deep difference? The deeper you get to know somebody, the more different they are from you. And I think Paul Rayfield said this thing, and it keeps ringing for me, that the first starting point is, and he's from the Adawa culture of Michigan, and he just said, all creation stories are true. That's the starting point. And it's like, okay, what? Yeah, all creation stories are true. That's the starting point, of anything. Meaning, you got to just accept everyone's position. So I wonder if, the baseline has to be, well, there's, again, I'm trying to take the architecture that I'm seeing as it's expressed in an indigenous cosmology and apply it. Delmar, you could totally think the earth is flat, and I could think the earth is round, and I'm right. But you might say, no, I'm right. And how do we actually feel that as a moment of beautiful tension that we're really cool with? That would be really far out, right? So I wonder, I don't know. And I'm thinking, Ruby Grace, that a lot of young people, one of the biggest things you see in the adolescent culture, quote unquote, without generalizing, is I gotta find my people who see things like I do, who like the music that I like, who will dress like me. And then it gets into the belonging and the need to other those who don't fit. And that's, again, I can't deal with the tension that we're so different. It seems like it's really hard for us in a world of truths, scientific truths, where people this is how it is. So I don't know. These are really broad, and I'm going to admit that I'm in a very early stage of trying to tangle with this indigenous system of thought that I've been looking at, which is all creation stories are true, fundamental. I don't know if that's even close. Great question. Excellent.
Sage?
Oh, yeah.
You go ahead. You sure? Yeah.
I think Sage, go for it. You
I
your
do
hand is
have
up a lot of that, and then
The thing I
Sean
have now
also.
is a different thing than the
Go
other
for it.
thing. Okay.
But you pulled the little tag number, your numbers up.
Well, still on Ruby's thing is like I think another like nugget or I like the baseline thing. That's like a big difference between the way that like children come into the world in an indigenous culture, in the way that I've been like a part of and learned from indigenous cultures is that like I think that when you come into the world, nothing has like less to offer than anything else. Is like something that I've heard talked about a lot, and I think like inherently in like our like Western societies for the most part, it's sort of like obvious that like well like some things like obviously like that wall doesn't have as much to offer as like Melodie does to the group, but the thing is that probably does. That's like a perspective of just like knowing that everything came from the same place and is like operating in the same way like in the universe, I guess. I don't know. I'm really at peace with that idea. So that's another thing, Ruby.
Well, maybe we can just hear and then see where we go from here.
We hear it. For some reason, symbiotic relationship seems to come to mind. But that's not a question. The question, or maybe it is, it seems like you're someone who's been given a lot of amazing gifts in life. And you referenced your mother earlier and talked about some beautiful stories there. I was wondering if we could hear a story. There's something there about Indigenous relationships that I get a sense has come from somewhere. I was wondering if you'd tell us a little bit of your personal relationship to that part of your life. Is that a clear question?
I think so. I'm not. Well, maybe, and I'm not totally following the piece around Indigenous relationships. Or you're just saying, like, are you asking me to kind of explore more what?
Yeah, I'm trying to rephrase it because I realise we're just about out of time. But could you share us a personal story in your life of somebody who helped influence that part of your life?
Thank you. I'm gonna ask Sean what is there just to get the things into the room, and the questions might, we can carry them forward in conversations outside of here. But
yeah, I was just gonna suggest that it just comes down to direct tangibility to sourcing your needs from nature directly. I think is one of the unifying pieces, that because we have so much technology built on top of just tangible nature, that we have this freedom to it doesn't matter if the world's flat or round, because in both those mindsets, when or where would you ever decide to spend the resources to prove that for your people to continue doing the things the way they've been doing? What really matters is that I need to grow corn. So whatever belief systems I have in those indigenous lifestyles were based on just direct feedback from the earth, I think. And I think that's the nugget, is when we have these kind of high-minded intellectual conversations, they're not really grounded in anything real. I don't need a cell phone, I don't need a car, I don't need electric lights, I don't need a brick and mortar building. I don't need any of those things to survive. I don't even provide for the people that I love around me. That's been demonstrated for millions of years. So we find ourselves in this place where we have sort of this fiat philosophy of that it matters that what I think, ideally, is true. But really, it doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, I can prove that the world is round, but does that make me able to grow corn any better? So this nugget about what else our team's missing, or just youth, or just people in general, I would say on a large scale, is that there's no tangible experience on a daily basis with getting their needs met themselves directly from the earth. And I think that sort of severs this cord of connection because it's like it frees our intellectual mind to just go out into space and just keep expanding and beyond, and it's almost like a mutation of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And a question that I want to add into there is that if then building that direct unmediated relationship to the source of our needs and simplifying them that way, to also be asking the question of, which necessitates having access to land, who has access to land, and what are the structures that enable some people to reconnect in those ways and deny other people the access to that. And just to be also think in all of it, like for me, it's helpful to see both the ways in which disconnection is happening and also the places where connection is maintained. To be not only looking at deficit, but also, which is, I don't hear you doing that, but just generally it makes me think of it. Like not only to be looking at deficit, but to be looking at the places where like that is happening, where people are in that kind of direct relationship with places that may not have that may not look pretty or be coming from a place of idealism. But really the question of just like in our efforts to rebuild unmediated relationship, direct relationship with place and the sources of our most basic needs, how are we doing that in a way that's making room for, and even just grappling meaningfully with the questions of what is it to be people who have access to land? And what is the story by which that comes to be true? And to be asking that in simultaneity with reweaving ourselves with places. It's a complex thing to weave myself in with this place that I don't come from.
I've heard something in what Sean said that brings something forward to me when he was talking about what matters. And the nugget that I see for me and the key is in reciprocity. It's in something I just read in the Croker blog that just came out, and we're talking about cutting the pine boughs to put on the floor. And somewhere in that messaging they were saying the tree knows and rejoices in the use of the pine bough for heat or for comfort. And so I think, to me, that's where it lives, because when I can connect with the goat and fulfill her need to be milked and to give it to me, and so it's this I feed you, you feed me relationship, that that's where it lives. That's where cosmology shifts, in my opinion. It's what matters, because then I see that my connection with that pine bough, or something that I eat or harvest or sweetgrass that I'm going to use to make a basket. Though there's this, it flourishes because I need it, and I flourish because I'm needed. There's something in that sort of cycle of reciprocity that I think is what matters. It's the key.
Thank you. Well, I think you go with wrapping, Delmar. I think it's time to wrap, knowing that we're now a few minutes over the time. And we'll just say big thank you for stepping into some of the conversations, and may we be stepping into them both in thought and also in our relationships. And one of the things that I've been carrying in this last year is this question of like, what if all of my relationships were creative partnerships in service to liberation? What if I was intentionally cultivating that as a shared vision in my relationships, knowing that that we have the opportunity in our ways of relating to be transforming what it means to be in relationship. And so may we carry it forward in continued inquiry, and keep me posted on what you find out there as the bridging is happening between the nature connection pieces and recognizing patterns on different levels and in different systems.
I shared this testimonial. It's been burning ever since Bridget was talking a while ago, which is just at the times when I've there was one 6-month period where I was totally living outside and practicing whatever you want to call nature connection practice all the time. And then there's another time there was a 3-month period that culminated in 1 month of totally solo, just inquiry, listening to the land on a really deep level. And both of those times in the weeks and months afterwards, I was able to interact in really charged situations without taking it personally whatsoever, or getting any feelings hurt whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And I never really looked at what that would be, but it always was very clear to me that there was a correlation between those two experiences. So I somehow really felt like I needed to
and that is a whole beautiful other realm of how does the natural world resource us? How do we resource ourselves in the natural world to be able to show up for the tension in more authentic, integral, and responsible ways? It's beautiful.
I want to thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna say something because this was a very unusual speaker series in the sense that Melodie right away didn't like the cult of virtuosity, which is sage on the stage, and that's something that's happened in all the arts where, instead of it being participatory dance or participatory music, which is what humans have done, it's we go there and sit down and someone stands up there who's a virtuoso and they do that for us. And I just wanted to thank you for noticing that in dialogue and in conversation that you didn't want to take on that layer of this cultural model, which is you're going to be the virtuoso and you're going to give all the wisdom and everyone's going to receive it and that's how it's going to go down. So I thank you for shaking that up and bringing it back to a really a more ancient ancestral way of being around the fire. I wish we had one to do that with. And I also do want to call out the virtuosity that you bring. Of heart and of word, it's incredible. These just moments of this very, very exquisite exposition of really complex and heartfelt things. And so I was really appreciating, it reminds me of a really good jazz, where there's this amazing solo and then we can take a little break. And then there's another really great solo. And so thank you for bringing that. And I want to just give that back to you as reflection because you have a lot there and I'm grateful that you brought it to us that way. And I also love that you shook it up and said, this isn't really where I'm most comfortable. And then that allowed a lot of crosstalk, which is really good. So thank you, Melodie, for all that. And thanks, everybody, who brought that in.
Thank you as well to all of us.